What if I told you that McLaren's first podium in Japan is not what it seems, and that its own CEO has just revealed a truth that could completely change the course of the season? The 2026 Japanese Grand Prix should not have been the scene of a podium for McLaren, and yet it was. But to understand why this result is so shocking, we have to go back a few weeks, to a start to the season that bordered on absolute disaster. McLaren not only arrived with doubts, it arrived practically without answers. In Australia, the first blow was immediate, with errors that already anticipated a complicated panorama, and in China the situation directly collapsed with electrical problems that left both cars out even before competing. There was no clear pace, there was not enough data, and most worryingly, there was no real understanding of the car. The MCL40 was, at that time, a car full of unknowns, a project that promised a lot in theory, but in practice was completely misaligned with the reality of the track. And that's the key point that many overlooked. McLaren arrived at Suzuka not as a podium contender, but as a team rebuilding internally. They had barely been able to complete a full race all season, meaning that everything related to strategy, tire management, long-run behavior, or even reliability remained uncharted territory. Japan was not an opportunity to stand out, it was a kind of covert test in the middle of the competition, a race where the main objective was not to gain positions, but to understand the car, collect information, and, above all, regain lost confidence within the team. Therefore, when that result arrives, when McLaren suddenly appears on the podium, what is truly surprising is not just the position. It is the contrast with everything that had been happening. Because this is not the typical case of a team that progressively evolves until it achieves success. Here we are talking about an unexpected leap in the midst of chaos, a result that not even the team itself had in its real forecast. And that is precisely where the Real story begins, because what seemed like a simple podium begins to become something much more complex when the complete context that surrounds it is analyzed. And this is where everything changes, because after crossing the finish line in Japan, what really shakes the paddock is not the result. It is the words of the McLaren CEO. Far from constructing a triumphalist speech or selling the idea that the team had taken a definitive leap, what it does is completely open the door to the internal reality they are experiencing. And that's what's surprising. Because instead of celebrating the podium as a confirmation of progress, he presents it almost as an anomaly within a process that is still far from stabilizing. He recognizes, implicitly but very clearly, that this result has exceeded the team's real expectations, suggesting that not even they expected to be in that position in Suzuka. But the most important thing is not only what he says, it is what he leaves between the lines. Because their statements reflect that within McLaren there is an evident tension between the potential they believe they have and the reality they have experienced on the track. Before Japan, the message was already clear. Total confidence in the pilots, in the structure, in the project, but also a growing pressure to solve problems that could no longer be hidden. And after the podium, that narrative doesn't change, which is even more telling. There is no excessive euphoria, there is no feeling of mission accomplished. There is caution, there is analysis, and above all there is a silent warning. The real work is not done yet. This completely redefines the meaning of the podium. Because it is no longer interpreted as the beginning of a winning streak, but as an isolated result within a still fragile context. A moment where everything went well in the middle of a scenario that remains uncertain. And when the CEO himself decides to communicate it in this way, he is sending a direct message to both the team and the rest of the grid. McLaren may be at the top, but it is not yet in control of its own performance. And that is, perhaps, the most important revelation of all. And then we come to the true consequence of all this. Because what Japan left behind is not a certainty, it is an even bigger unknown. That podium, far from confirming that McLaren has definitively returned to the fight, what it does is expose something much more delicate. The team still does not fully understand its own car. And in modern Formula One, that is a sign as dangerous as it is exciting. Because it means that the performance we saw at Suzuka could be just a small taste of much greater potential, or just an isolated peak amidst an unstable foundation. The MCL40 is still a project under construction, a car that has shown flashes, but has had structural problems since the start of the season. Lack of data, reliability gaps, and the constant need to adapt have forced the team to work in a reactive rather than proactive mode. And that is precisely what the CEO suggests with his statements. McLaren is not yet in control of its performance, it is still in the discovery phase. The podium in Japan doesn't change that, it just disguises it momentarily. And this is where the story gets really interesting, because what comes from now on will be the real test. If McLaren can turn this result into a solid foundation, then Japan will be remembered as the turning point that marked its definitive comeback. But if the problems reappear, if the inconsistency is still present, then this podium will go down in history as a mirage, as a bright moment in the middle of a storm that has not yet ended. And that is the great unknown that the CEO himself leaves open with his message. We are not seeing the final result. We are just seeing the beginning of something that we still do not know what it is going to become. But if there is something that this whole scenario really reveals, it is what this result means internally for McLaren. Because here we are no longer just talking about performance, we are talking about direction, identity, and where the team is really moving this season. The podium in Japan not only puts pressure on the car, it also puts pressure on the decisions that are made from now on. Because when a result arrives before the project is completely ready, it forces the team to accelerate processes, to make more aggressive decisions, and above all, to no longer be able to hide their weaknesses. And this connects directly with what the CEO has hinted. McLaren believes in its potential, but knows that it has not yet unlocked its true performance. That means that each race from this point on becomes a constant test, where not only the final result matters, but the team's ability to understand why everything happens. It is no longer enough to score points, now they need consistency, they need to repeat performance, they need to show that what happened in Japan was not circumstantial. And that is a much more complex leap than it seems, because it involves going from reacting to problems, to controlling them before they appear. In addition, there is a silent but determining factor in all this, the reading made by the rest of the grid. Because this podium does not go unnoticed. Rivals now look at McLaren differently, no longer as a rebuilding team, but as a potential threat that can burst in at any moment. And that completely changes the competitive context. More strategic pressure, less room for error, and constant attention to every move they make. McLaren is no longer invisible, and that, in Formula One, can be as dangerous as it is beneficial. Ultimately, this fourth act is not about the podium itself, but about what it triggers. Because from now on, every decision, every evolution of the car, and every result will be conditioned by what happened in Japan. And if the team fails to transform that surprise into a solid foundation, then everything that today seems like a step forward could become the source of pressure that ends up working against them. McLaren's real challenge was not getting on the podium, it was everything that comes after having achieved it. And this is where everything comes to a head. Because after Japan, McLaren can no longer hide behind the process narrative. That margin completely disappears the moment you get a podium in the midst of uncertainty. Now the team enters a completely different phase, where each result begins to define not only its season, but the real credibility of its project. Because it's one thing to promise potential, and quite another to sustain it under constant pressure. What the CEO hinted at takes on even more weight at this point, because his words no longer sound like a simple analysis, they sound like an internal warning. McLaren knows that it has opened a dangerous door, that of expectations. And in Formula One, poorly managed expectations can be more destructive than technical failures themselves. Now everyone hopes to see that car back on top, they expect consistency, they expect evolution. But the team is still in a phase where it is still discovering the real limits of the MCL40. And that disconnection between what is expected from the outside and what they can really offer is where the real risk arises. Furthermore, this moment marks a psychological change within the team, because they no longer compete only against their rivals. Now they also compete against the image that they themselves have projected in Japan. Every mistake is magnified, every discrete result is questioned, and every strategic decision comes under scrutiny. And that requires a level of operational maturity that only fully consolidated teams can sustain. McLaren is entering that territory, but has not yet proven that it can stay there. Therefore, this act is not about pure performance, but about the exact moment in which a team goes from promise to reality, or gets stuck along the way. Japan was the trigger, but what comes next is what will really define their season. Because if they manage to sustain this level, then everything the CEO said will be remembered as the beginning of a transformation. But if they fail, if the inconsistency reappears, then that same message will be reinterpreted as a sign that they themselves knew they were not ready yet. And that's where this story can completely change its meaning. What the Japanese Grand Prix left is not an answer, it is a warning. Because when McLaren's own CEO decides to speak with that frankness after a podium, he is making it clear that within the team they know that they have not yet reached where they want to be. This result does not validate the project. It does not confirm that everything is working, it simply demonstrates that even in the midst of chaos, McLaren has the ability to appear on top when conditions align. But that is not enough to sustain a fight for the championship. And that's the key to everything. This podium doesn't define McLaren, it puts it to the test. Because now expectations change, the pressure increases, and the margin for error disappears. They are no longer the team trying to recover, they are now the team that has shown that they can be ahead, even if they still don't know exactly how to repeat it consistently. And that, in such a demanding season, can work both for and against. So the big question is not what happened in Japan, but what will happen next. Because if this result was the start of a trend, we are facing McLaren's definitive return to the elite. But if it was just an isolated moment, then what its CEO revealed makes even more sense. The real work is just beginning, and the team's future remains an unknown that will be resolved race by race. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.